For the A9 dueling decades, I think, Deputy Presiding Officer, for that. And again, it's this administration which is actually taking that forward, unlike previous administrations. The member is right to say, of course, there will be disruption, and he's also right to say that there can be frustration from people who are affected by that. But please be assured that Transport Scotland, the operating companies and the contractors in relation to the dueling works in particular, are very experienced at this, and they do take into account when the heaviest traffic flows are likely to be there. They do try as best they can to minimise disruption. I think it's also worth saying that in addition to the dueling works, we do have some improvement works which are going on just now, and a very particular incident as well, which is also causing some traffic disruption. But we do try and minimise this as far as possible. We're well aware of the extent to which communities right along the line in the member's constituency and right along the length of the A9 are affected by these works. But in the end, it's very important that we carry out this dueling, as the member has mentioned. We'll do that with regard to trying to minimise any disruption as far as we can.
Thanks. And that concludes that portfolio. And we now move to portfolio questions on culture, Europe and external affairs. I call on question 1, Sarah Boyack. Just give us a minute, Ms Boyack, and once the Cabinet Secretary is ready. Right.
To ask the Scottish Government what recent discussions regarding new cultural investment it has had with the City of Edinburgh Council.
Secretary.
I met with councillors and officials of the City of Edinburgh Council on the 5th of August 2015 to discuss the Council's vision and strategic priorities around cultural capital spending projects. Scottish Government officials had a follow-up meeting with the Chief Executive and Executive Director of Culture, City Strategy and Economy on the 11th of August.
Sarah Boyack.
Can I welcome that engagement and ask the Minister if she supports the St Mary's Music School proposal for a centre of excellence in the Old Royal High School, a win-win for culture, and will she now support the development of a tourism levy so that the Council can invest in historic buildings and arts venues the City needs if it's to retain its status as a global centre of cultural excellence, given the 8.5% reduction in funding for local government noted by Audit Scotland this year?
Thanks, Cabinet Secretary.
On the second point, I note that I understand that to be part of the proposals that have been put forward for a potential Edinburgh City deal that's been put forward by the Council. That obviously is subject for discussion with Cabinet colleagues across government. Certainly there is some strong resistance, as you'll be aware, to a tourism levy, but I do think it's important that we address the cultural engine that is Edinburgh and how we can drive forward that agenda. On the first point, I hope she appreciates that with my responsibilities as Minister with responsibility for Historic Scotland and indeed some of the issues around listed buildings, it is not possible or indeed appropriate for me to comment on the first part of her question.
Thanks. Question 2, Alison McInnes.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government when it last discussed the refugee crisis with the UK Government.
Minister Humza Yousaf.
The First Minister and I met Foreign Secretary Philip Hammond on the 21st of September, welcoming the UK Government's recent decision to take refugees, making the case that the UK, of course, must go further than it has and set out a clear timetable to meet its commitments. On the 21st of September, I also met with the UK Government's newly appointed Minister for Refugees, Richard Harrington, with responsibility specifically for Syrian refugees, to discuss in detail some of the practical actions that we can take forward and that are necessary to coordinate the arrival of refugees. Furthermore, representatives of the UK Home Office attend the Refugee Task Force, which last met on Wednesday, the 23rd of September, and indeed the most recent weekly teleconference between the Home Office officials, local government officials and the Scottish Government took place last Friday, the 25th of September.
Alison McInnes.
Thank the Minister for that reply. I share the Minister's view that the UK should take more refugees than is currently planned. Has the Scottish Government carried out an assessment of local councils' capacity to accommodate refugees, and does he believe that the capacity is there for us to take more than Scotland's so-called fair share of what we both agree is a pitifully small number for the UK as a whole? And if so, has he told the UK Government that our Government is willing to provide for more than our fair share in order to boost the overall UK number?
Minister.
I thank the member and note and put on record her own interest in this subject over a number of years in terms of refugees and those seeking asylum in this country. What I would say to her is I've never, in the 3 years that I've been in government, seen such a really effort for local authorities, Scottish Government and the UK Government, particularly the Home Office, to work seamlessly together to ensure we're all coordinating our efforts across this important issue. So I would say that's very positive. I would say the response from local authorities to the member has been overwhelming. In terms of the detail of how much capacity there is per local authority area, what I would say is I know that COSLA are collating that information. It would be wrong of me to breach any of the confidences that COSLA have shared with me, but I'm very confident that if refugees were to arrive tomorrow, then we would be in a good place to be able to provide them with not just suitable accommodation, but the appropriate services that wrap around them as well. But I'm happy to keep the member up to date. In terms of increasing our own number, it should be said that when we talk about that fair share, that 10% roughly of the UK number, if we're able to do more, then of course the Scottish Government has never been found wanting when it's come to its response to refugees.
Thanks. Claire Baker.
Thank you. While the UK Government have committed to 20,000 refugees over 5 years, the Minister will know there has been calls for a front-loading of the number of refugees. Has the Minister discussed this with the UK Government, if there's a possibility of Scotland front-loading the number of refugees we are looking to support?
Minister.
I think it's an important point that the member raises. She'll know that there's no disagreement from the Scottish Government in terms of her proposal. I did discuss it with the Minister for Refugees, and I have to say he's actively considering that, and the Home Office are thinking of that. I don't think I would be breaching any confidences at all to say that they understand that this won't be a 4,000 per year or a 5,000 per year job at all. They're thinking of how they can immediately help, and any assistance that Scotland can provide, whether it's taking people immediately, then that is something, again, that we would be happy to consider.
Next question 3, Willie Coffey.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update in its response to the refugee crisis.
Minister.
Thank the member for the question. The First Minister convened a refugee summit earlier this month, bringing together a wide number of stakeholders. That summit, she announced a task force would be set up, of which I chair. This task force has now met 3 times and has established 2 subgroups, one looking at refugee accommodation, the other one looking at refugee integration, which both met for the first time last Tuesday. As the Scottish Government, we've made available an initial £1 million to ensure that services across Scotland are prepared to deal with the arrival of refugees. The response from local authorities has been very positive, and we're ready to assist refugees as soon as they arrive.
Thanks, Willie Coffey.
I thank the Minister for that answer. Could he possibly further update us on any particular numbers agreed by local authorities, and whether any additional central support has been requested to assist with things like language difficulties that might arise?
Minister.
I think the member's point is a very important one. COSLA, as I mentioned in a previous answer, they are collating that information. Of course, we have to give them the appropriate time to do that. The Refugee Emergency Summit was only convened just over 3 weeks ago, so we're moving at a heck of a pace. But the point that the member makes is very important. Of course, local authorities will have to think about the financial pressures that they're perhaps already under, but also the financial pressures of taking in refugees. And what I would say is the discussion between the Home Office, local authorities, of which the Scottish Government is also involved, I have to say the tone of that has been very positive and very constructive from all sides. And there will be certain gaps in service provision, particularly local authorities. Glasgow clearly has a lot of expertise, has the integration services there, but that's not the same for local authorities across Scotland. And where those gaps do exist, the Scottish Government, the Home Office and the local authorities will work together to plug those gaps.
Alex Johnson.
Since we last experienced our comparable refugee crisis, there has been a significant change in the structure of public housing in Scotland. Will the Minister undertake to ensure that when the decisions are made about where these refugees will be housed, that will avoid the 2 key errors, firstly of housing too many all in the same place, and secondly, that we can avoid the situation where local authorities are forced to provide housing in pressurised areas where there are already people who have been in the waiting list for a long time and may be alienated by this process?
I thank the member for raising what I think are a couple of important points. It's important to recognise that, of course, when refugees arrive here, they'll have the same rights as anybody else in terms of the homelessness legislation that we have in this country. The points that he makes, I think, are well understood by the task force that I convened, that we don't want to, in effect, create ghettoisation. We know that that is not conducive to not the refugees themselves, but, of course, the communities in which they end up being housed. So we're very aware of that. So we would like to see refugees dispersed across a wider area, and I've been very overwhelmed by local authorities from across Scotland offering to take in their share of refugees. And in terms of the communities themselves, there's an understanding that we will have to work closely with the communities before refugees even arrive to make sure that there's community buy-in. And so I think the points about housing and housing pressures are well made, and it's something that the Refugee Task Force is very conscious of.
Okay, Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Is the Minister open to considering accommodation that's not local authority accommodation or even social rented accommodation to be considered in the going forward with the situation.
Minister.
There's been plenty of offers of accommodation, and I would say our preference as a government would be to work with local authorities to what is the most suitable. And at the moment, if we can manage it within existing social housing stock, then that will be the preference for not just the government but also all the partners involved in the Ministerial Task Force. There have been some very generous and very kind offers that have come in. So where those offers, I think at the moment we're at the stage of exploring and collating as much information as possible. So I would say to the member, if there are particular offers that have come in to him, please do forward them on to us. And as I say, we keep an open mind on all of these issues.
Many thanks. Question 4, Rob Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government how Scotland's traditional arts are funded.
Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government supports traditional arts through a number of its public bodies. Creative Scotland has, for example, awarded £1.4 million to 156 applicant organisations and individuals since it's opened its project funding in October last year, with a success rate of 37%, significantly higher than other art forms. In addition to the £7 million over 2015-18 to its regularly funded organisations working on traditional arts, Creative Scotland has published a full list of their support for traditional arts on their website on the 15th of September. There is Scottish Government funding over the traditional arts from Heathrow and Gatwick, our Youth Music Initiative, the Festivals Expo Fund and BBC Alpa. In addition, Radio Nangale has given significant exposure to traditional music and contributed to its funding.
Thanks, Rob Gibson.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. I think generally the Scottish traditional music sector sees big improvements to their status during the time of the Scottish Government since 2007. But the Scottish Government's Traditional Arts Working Party also agreed that an equivalent to national companies should be explored for the traditional arts. So in order to give parity of esteem, is that proposal being taken forward?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank the member for his question. I think it's an important area, particularly in relation to that parity of esteem, and that's something we've worked very, very hard over the period of this government to achieve. I think the concept of how you work in terms of a national company perhaps may not be suited to work in the traditional arts, but I am interested in his proposals and will ask officials to look further into that aspect. He's right to refer to it as being one of the proposals from the Traditional Arts Working Group, and it's, although many of the other aspects of that working group recommendations have been taken forward, this is one that to date has not.
Thanks, Mary Scanlon.
Thank you. In evidence to the Education Committee, the Traditional Music and Song Association for Scotland said they were having very serious difficulties accessing funding, in other words, they were unsuccessful, to support young musicians to develop their career as well as bringing their music to diverse communities in Scotland. They were only asking for under £15,000. Why didn't they get it?
Cabinet Secretary.
The member will be aware that ministers themselves would not consider individual applications of that level for funds that are administered by Creative Scotland, and indeed she may be familiar not only with the fantastic work of Fesh Ross in delivering the Youth Music Initiative, but I visited Inverness and Eden Court, which is now one of the new youth arts hubs that have been set up as part of our youth arts strategy, and again fantastic traditional music taking place led from there. I am aware that Mary Scanlon raised support for traditional arts in the Education and Culture Committee on the 15th of September, and the Scotsman published an article quoting her that was subsequently withdrawn, along with an apology from the editor to the Chief Executive of Creative Scotland about its contents and the accuracy of the full picture.
Many thanks. Question 5, Jenny Marrett.
To ask the Scottish Government whether the V&A project in Dundee will be audited by Audit Scotland.
Cabinet Secretary.
A decision on whether to audit any aspect of the V&A Dundee project would entirely be a matter for Audit Scotland. The Scottish ministers have no role in such a decision.
Many thanks. Jenny Marrett.
I hope that Audit Scotland may take this consideration very seriously then, and the Cabinet Secretary may do all she can to perhaps encourage that in whichever way is appropriate, because she will know as well as I do that there are concerns about spiralling costs of this project, and there are also